view. Okay. Slideshow, begin. Setup. Okay. Confidentiality and privacy. Let me just check something quick. Okay. Okay. In our last lecture, we looked at reasons why doctors may want to withhold information from their patients from time to time. In this lecture, we'll examine why it is that patients may desire to withhold their medical information from various parties. In other words, we'll be looking at the patient's right to privacy. Our first article by James Rachels is a discussion of the value of privacy, generally speaking, and is not restricted to medical contexts. Our second article by Siegler is a discussion of why privacy is so difficult to maintain in a modern, highly integrated hospital setting. Okay. So, many reasons for desiring privacy. One thing which philosophers like to do is give an explanation for why a specific idea is important, which applies to all the cases that involve that idea. And this is called giving a unitary explanation. Rachels wants to give a unitary explanation of why privacy is important in human relationships, where relationship is defined very broadly, so as to include most human interactions. Rachels begins his article by taking the possibility that no unitary explanation for the value of privacy is possible. He lists 4 very different types of situations in which it's important to someone to maintain privacy, and notes that it is initially plausible to assign each a unique explanation. In the first situation, Bobby Fischer, the chess player, needs to maintain privacy so as not to be at a competitive disadvantage. In the second case, privacy needs to be maintained in order to avoid embarrassment. In the third case, which is really a set of related cases involving medical contexts, privacy needs to be maintained in order to avoid marital breakup or the loss of a job or to enable one to maintain eligibility for insurance. In the fourth case, one needs to maintain privacy in order to not be denied credit due to discriminating information being made public. This bewildering array of reasons why people need to maintain privacy in various instances makes it look as if there is no general explanation of why privacy is important that covers all cases. Which covers all cases. This is an undesirable result from an explanatory perspective. Hence, Rachels proceeds to search for a deeper account of why privacy is important. We'll discuss his account shortly after we pause to note a peculiarity of our insurance system before recent reform took place. Withholding information from insurance companies. Before Obamacare was passed, insurance companies had the legal right to deny coverage for people with pre-existing conditions. Insurance companies also had the legal right to base the price you pay for your coverage on what they know about your health in particular. Hence, if you were once treated for cancer but were now in remission, an insurance company could charge outrageous sums for future cancer coverage. Question 1b asks if it's morally justifiable to withhold information from insurance companies which would affect how much they charge you. I suspect most of you think this is perfectly ethical, but why? My suggestion is that the whole point of medical insurance is to spread the costs of various medical risks. The basic idea is that if everyone pays an affordable amount into a common pot of money, then everyone will be covered in the case of an emergency. If insurance companies are allowed to exclude or overcharge people who are known to have illnesses, then this undermines the rationale for insurance in the first place. The very people who need it most will be least likely to afford it, and those least likely to need it will have it. This is not a very rational system. This may explain why we think deliberately withholding information from such companies is not unethical, since such withholding of information allows insurance to serve its intended role. Rachel's general account of the value of privacy. We now return to Rachel's main project. He wants to give a unitary account of why privacy is important to us. His suggestion is that privacy enables us to maintain the variety of social relationships we have with other people. He gives some excellent examples of how limiting the flow of information and maintaining control over what specific people know about us allows us to engage in a variety of social roles and relationships which wouldn't otherwise be possible. He maintains that refraining from using crude language in front of one's mother-in-law, even though one is not offended by such language oneself, may be necessary to maintain a smooth relationship with her. If one is in charge of a group of people in a work setting, it is best that they not know of one's moral failings in other spheres of life or about any stories which would decrease their respect for one. We enter into relationships with insurance companies in order to be able to pay for healthcare. This is harder to achieve if they have information which motivates them to deny coverage. Notice that this explanation applies to all of the original cases which Rachel's initially discussed. Being embarrassed ruins certain social interactions, as does being put at a strategic disadvantage. Privacy is important because it allows us to control our various social identities. What's wrong with wearing a mask? One might be bothered by the suggestion that it's acceptable to deliberately portray oneself to various groups in very different ways depending on what is demanded of one and what's one's own goals are. You might think that one might think this wearing of social masks is in some sense inauthentic and that one should be one's true self everywhere, every time. Rachel's disagrees. For one thing, he objects to the mask metaphor. He doesn't think we necessarily have a true self, which is deeper than the roles which we take on. For example, as your instructor, I will tell you very little about my life outside of philosophy, apart from the brief bio. This makes sense, as it is my job to teach you how to think about ethics in a rational manner. Hence, I wouldn't dream of friending any of you on Facebook or sharing wild stories from my youth. This would undercut the goal of this particular social relationship. Yet, why think that this makes my identity as a teacher any less significant or deep than my identity as a mother or a U.S. citizen? The fact that I'm deliberate about structuring our interactions does not mean that I'm putting on a false face. Different facets of our personality come out in different roles and relationships we take on. Hence, there is nothing disingenuous going on, at least not necessarily. In 2C, I asked for your response to Rachel's suggestion that it's a mistake to distinguish between our true self and the various roles we take on. I'm curious to read your answers. It is not your business. According to Rachel's, a piece of personal information is someone else's business only if there is a social relationship which exists between you and that person, which entitles that person to know that information. If we only desire to exist in a particular type of relationship with another person, such as a doctor patient, teacher student, that relationship can best be preserved and flourish if each person only knows information about the other which is relevant to that relationship. This ties in well with Rachel's general account of the value of privacy. Question 4 asks for your reflections on the ways certain advances in technology are restructuring our social relationships in ways in which privacy is diminished. Facebook is an excellent example. People now put terrifically intimate details about themselves online for a broad audience to see. It is as if people are trying to star in their own reality TV shows. I look forward to reading your reflections on this phenomenon. We have now arrived at Siegler's article on patient confidentiality in the context of the hospital. Siegler begins by describing a patient who's receiving treatment at a modern medical facility for mild chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. In other words, this patient was having some troubles with his lungs. Upon looking into the patient's concern that too many people had access to his records, Siegler discovered that no less than 75 health professionals and hospital personnel had reviewed his records during the course of his brief and not terrifically extensive treatment. Siegler notes that this patient's doctors didn't need to involve multiple consultants or use specialized procedures, nor did they need to involve physical therapists, social workers, or chaplains. In this sense, this patient's care was normal. What is interesting is that all of these persons had a legitimate need to access his records. Everyone except the medical students were involved in his care in some way. Even if the patient gave an order to restrict them from knowing the details of his care, that would still leave 60 people who had access. Siegler notes that this is inevitable in a hospital setting in which healthcare professionals work as teams so that each relevant expert can have a say in how the patient's care should proceed. This approach has the obvious advantage of improving the quality of care as long as everyone on the team is communicating well. One of the disadvantages is a breach of confidentiality as traditionally understood. We can no longer picture appointments with a doctor as only taking place between a patient and her family physician. This is still common, but once any kind of advanced treatment is needed, a team usually takes over. What changes can be made to ensure a higher level of privacy? First, Siegler notes privacy should remain a priority at the millions of doctor-patient encounters which take place at traditional physicians' offices. Second, Siegler suggests that hospitals should divide a patient's medical records into sections. For example, the billing portion could be kept separate from the portion which details the treatments. Third, patients need to be informed of just how public their private information has become within the context of a modern hospital. This isn't really a solution, but at least a patient will know what is going on and will be better able to advocate for herself or himself if the need arises. Which leads us to Siegler's final point. He thinks the patient should get the chance to review the compiled information and decide which information can be shared broadly and which information should remain closed to all but her and her primary care physician. This would involve a process which mimics the process of informing patients of their treatment options to begin with. Ziegler also notes a method which he doesn't want to be widely used. Psychiatrists are in the habit of keeping the information they have on a patient in a separate file from the patient's general record. This does ensure a higher degree of confidentiality, but if all medical professionals adopted the same practice, it would become difficult indeed for a doctor to gain access to these files. Hence, Ziegler wants the general record approach to remain dominant, but he wants to limit access to various portions of that patient's record to a need-to-know basis.